Good evening, everybody. Welcome to class number 2 of the Shaping of Middle-earth. Welcome back. So tonight we are we're moving swiftly and with alacrity through more slides than you will even believe. We got more than halfway through the sketch, or not the sketch, not the Quenta, but the sketch last time. I want to resume there. We were up to about Baron and Luthien. I want to resume there, look at a few things from the end of the sketch especially, and then shift to looking at the 1930 Quenta. But first, quickly, some announcements. 2 quick announcements. First is our spring classes have started this semester. There is still time to enroll. You think about if you haven't signed up yet, there's still time to, and I encourage you to consider signing up for my Modern Fantasy class or for Dr. Andrew Higgins's Language Invention through Tolkien class, which will be which is just again such a neat opportunity in that class, not just to learn Elvish, not only to learn Elvish, but not only to learn Elvish, but to be learning about Tolkien's whole language invention process and how his language is developed over time. So cool. Anyway, so I just wanted to encourage you to look into that. There is still some time, but that time is fast running out. So just remember that. And then the second thing is to tell you about an upcoming event. It's a kind of a peculiar upcoming event. I'm not going to make any bones about that. But it's an unusual upcoming event. And that is the Great Chicken Run. So I don't even know how to explain this. Like, starting at the beginning will take too long. There's too much. I will sum up. So on Saturday, January 30th, I am going to be spending about 8-ish hours streaming live while I run on foot from Mickle Delving to Minas Tirith in the form of a chicken. It's one of those things which, if you play Lord of the Rings online, you'll know just what I'm talking about. And if you don't, you'll have the faintest idea what I'm talking about. But take my word for it. We can do that. So anyway, yeah. So we're gonna do. This is the follow up to our fundraising campaign where we promised we would do this if we raised enough money, and we did. So I'm doing the Great Minas Tirith Chicken Run, and I'm really looking forward to touring around. For those of you who don't play the game, they just opened Minas Tirith in the game a couple months ago. I've never seen it, and I'm really keen to wander the streets of Minas Tirith and see what they've done with it. I've heard, for instance, that there are sort of plaques and statues that represent all of the kings of Gondor, and you can find them all over the city. So anyway, I'm going to be dashing all over the city in the form of a chicken, and examining stuff until my time runs out. So anyway, as I said, it's a rather unusual event, but Saturday the 30th of January is when that's going down. Karita, what happens if I die? We don't want to think about what happens if I die. Yeah, you have to start over completely if you die. So if I were to run in the form of a chicken from Mickle Delving all the way to the Ramas and get randomly killed by something there, I might cry. But I hope that won't happen. So we're gonna hope for the best there. But yes, we do have Josh Ramsey, who's here, is going to be helping. He's going to be helping in the form of bait. He has a level 10 hobbit that he's going to run along in front of my chicken to draw out any of the enemies that would want to attack me, and they'll attack him instead because he's far more tasty. Anyway, it'll be, like I say, it's the kind of thing it's hard to explain if you don't play Lotro, but it's It'll be a fun time and a sort of a fun community project for our Mythgard kinship there on Lotro. But anyway, but you are all invited. You don't have to play the game. I'll be streaming it on the internet, so you'll be you'll be able to catch some pieces of the chicken run if you would like to see exactly what this crazy thing is about. Anyway, okay, back to the sketch of the mythology. Okay, so remember briefly what the sketch is, right? The sketch is a plot summary that Tolkien drew up explicitly to give context for an external reader who is going to read the lay of the children, the alliterative lay of the children of Húrin, right? So that the sketch is in itself, as I was saying last time, not a literary text, right? It's not designed to be a work of literature, just a plot summary, right? A sketch, something like an outline. And I find this to be something, I mean, this is priceless, actually. In some ways you could say, like, oh, the sketch of the mythology, the 1926 sketch, it's not much, right? I mean, it's just, a few paragraphs kind of giving the, and there's so much that it leaves out probably, and, and it's not all that much, it's not all that good to read, because it's kind of brief and kind of blunt. Yeah, but it's priceless, right? I mean, let's look at the bright side here. On the one hand, if it were a literary text, Tolkien probably wouldn't have finished it, right? So, I mean, Tolkien never finished that kind of thing. He'd have gotten carried away. So the fact that he was just writing a sort of an overview survey helped him to get through it, right? So that's a good thing. But more than that, there's some enormous benefits that we can see in this. Of course, you can see, obviously one interesting benefit is sort of seeing how the stories are developing in his mind. I mean, it's been a while now, 1926, it's now been a while, almost 10 years since he shelved the Lost Tales, the Book of Lost Tales. He's been working on stuff, right? He's been doing the epic poetry, in particular the alliterative lay of the children of Húrin. But, and he's about to start the Lay of Leithian. But still, it's been a while, right? So we can see the progression of his overall thought and the shape of the stories and the mythology. And of course, that's what Christopher Tolkien emphasizes most in his commentaries on, the 19 sections of the sketch that he breaks it down into. But for my money, that's not even the coolest thing about the sketch. The coolest things about the sketch are just, if you see what I mean, the mere fact that Tolkien is summarizing. That is to say, the fact that the project that Tolkien has set for himself is, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to jot down the important elements. I'm going to boil the whole mythology down to, its most essential points and just lay those out, right? Oh my gosh. That means he's doing that work for us, right? That is what we're seeing here. Like I was emphasizing last time, Christopher Tolkien keeps emphasizing just because something is left out doesn't mean that, Tolkien has definitely chosen to omit it, right? That he's changed his mind about including it. Of course, true enough. But what I was emphasizing was, what we can know is that the stuff that's there is important, right? Not only is it present still, but it was important enough to be included in this overview, right? So that's really cool, so just, having him even knowing, even granting that there's probably a lot of other detail, to those stories. Obviously there's more detail to those stories, but, so there's going to be some stuff that he's leaving out entirely. And yet, wow, let's pay attention to the stuff that he actually hits on, the stuff that he actually emphasizes, because we rarely get that kind of opportunity for him to go through and say, here's what's important, here's what's important, here's what's important. But also, even sort of more than that, there's a way in which I feel, and it's not that, I mean, if the sketch of the mythology were all that we had of the Silmarillion, if it were like the de facto final product, it'd be a little bit disappointing, because it's not a literary text. It doesn't have, the sort of the beauty that we see in the published Silmarillion. But what we do have in the sketch is the overall shape of the stories in his mind. And those of you who have, been with us through the our examinations, our readings of the first 3 volumes of the History of Middle-earth series will remember how frustrating it kind of gets at the end of the Book of Lost Tales Volume 2, right? That is when we get to the part where they peter out, especially with the Earendel stuff and the faring forth and then the shift to Alfwine. And you guys will remember all these little fragmentary texts that Christopher Tolkien is bringing in, and he's pretty sure that these are from that period, and this is probably the order they should go in, but here's 5 different versions of these fragmentary stories, and we don't really, it's hard to get the narrative, right? Christopher Tolkien does a great job of piecing it together and giving his best guesses at what the shape of the narrative were, or what the shapes of these different narratives that Tolkien is projecting at different times are, but it's all really confusing, and it's really hard to come out of it with a story. But by golly, the sketch of the mythology, the 1926 sketch, has a shape, right? It's a story. And we get to Earendel, and it's like, wow, an Earendel story, right? Not 4 fragmentary versions of things which may or may not go together, but an actual story. And we can see within, how it fits in with the whole rest of the story. Wow, how about that, right? So, for these reasons, I really love the sketch, and I find it really fascinating and important to look at. In addition, of course, we also get some interesting little nuggets, kind of dropped here and there. So let's. Nick Marazzo is pointing out the final fate of Turin during the Great Rack. Yeah, and I agree, Nick, the Great Rack. Isn't that an awesome name? I mean, just the use of the word rack, W-R-A-C-K, in that way is just, I say in that way, as if you tend to use the word rack, W-R-A-C-K, in any other way. But anyway, I too love that phrase. Anyhow, so let's then proceed. Look at the snippets I wanted to look at of the end of the sketch. With sort of this kind of framework in mind here. You're right, Denise Kelly. We do still say sometimes one still might talk about rack and ruin. You can see that's still the same word, right? It's still like in the language, but it's rarely, even that phrase is rarely used. And I think actually, Denise, it's because I'm not sure I've ever seen the word rack used without the word ruin, right? It's always one of those, it's like spick and span, right? I mean, it's fine to say like, oh, that, it looks spick and span, right? But would you ever say like, wow, it really looks span in here? No, not spick so much, but span, absolutely. I mean, there's some words that they're in pairs, right? And you never think of it. It's weird to think of it on its own. Rack was sort of one of those for me. A nook and a cranny, Karita, exactly, right? You can have a breakfast nook, right? But you don't get crannies so very often. Anyway, sorry, okay. Moving on. Back to Beren and Luthien. This is one of the things, I mean, of course we could talk more about the Beren and Luthien story, but we talked about that a good bit last time, I think, unless I've gone crazy. I'm pretty sure I talked about the Beren and Luthien story quite a bit last time. One confession I have to make between, reading the sketch and reading the Quenta and remembering the Lost Tales, and I'm rereading the published Silmarillion right now for pleasure anyway, because I always read the Silmarillion in January, and thinking about the Film project. I have 6 versions of the Silmarillion stories going around in my head at the same time, and I talk about various one of them to various groups of people at different times. So I apologize if I forget where I am or who I've said what to or what story I'm talking about. If you find this kind of hard to keep track of all of these things, don't worry. It's hard for me too. Anyway, okay. Beren, Luthien, Fading of the Elves. Here we go. Okay. When Mandos let Beren return with Luthien, it was only at the price that Luthien should become as short-lived as Beren the mortal. Luthien now fades, even as the elves in later days faded, as men grew strong and took the goodness of earth, for the elves needed the light of the trees. At last she vanished, and Beren was lost, looking in vain for her, and his son Dior ruled after him. Okay. We talked about the Beren and Luthien story. What happens at the end of the Beren and Luthien story, that is the mortality of Luthien? One thing, and Christopher Tolkien emphasizes this, which this is why I didn't want to spend all that much time on it, because Christopher Tolkien explains it, I think, quite well. Whatever is exactly happening here, we can certainly see that the story is not presented anything close to as simply as it will eventually become. The final sort of simplicity and elegance of the end of the Beren and Luthien story, namely that Luthien becomes mortal and is sort of accounted among the humans, right? That she sort of is moved over from the immortal elves into the mortal humans. She chooses to join herself to her husband. That's the condition of her coming back and everything. Of his coming back. So that idea is really nice. What's going on here is much more complicated. At the very least, it's much more complicated than that. But the one brief nugget that I wanted to extract from this, like I said, what's one of the other things that is to me of great interest in the sketch is we get these sort of nuggets of lore that kind of pop out, right? Where we can see not about the overall shape of the story, though we see that too, but to see sort of where Tolkien's thought on particular ideas related to his mythology stand. In this case, the fading of the elves. You notice that? So Luthien now fades even as the elves in later days faded, as men grew strong and took the goodness of earth, for the elves needed the light of the trees. That's like 3 eye-openers in one sentence, as far as I'm concerned, right? First, Luthien now fades even as the elves in later days faded. Wow, really? So that's what happened to Luthien? So Luthien's fading, the thing that happens to Luthien when she gets the Silmaril, and as a consequence of her transaction with Mandos, what happens with Luthien is even as the fading of the elves in later days. So when we talk about the fading or the dwindling of the elves, that Tolkien initially conceived that as being like the fading of Luthien here. So that's, again, so it's, in other words, it's not just that means, again, so notice that what I'm drawing a conclusion here about, or rather what I'm interested in, is not what this says about Luthien, but about what this says about the later elves, right? The fading of the elves as time goes by is not a question of just like slow, gradual, like I shall diminish, and go into the west. That's not how he's conceiving this, right? It's like a kind of death. It's like becoming mortal, right? That Luthien should become as short-lived as Beren the Mortal. It's like that, right? Even as the elves in later days, as men grew strong and took the goodness of earth, it's like a kind of death, right? Not a slow change that happens to them over time, worked on in some sense by the air of Middle-earth or whatever, but rather it's like mortality that comes upon them. That's a wholly new context, anyway, new for me, to think about the fading of the elves in the later times. In fact, not only do I find this eye-opening sort of at this point, it makes me want to go back and look at the Book of Lost Tales again and be like, whoa, is that the way he was thinking about it before? I mean, because, he talks about the fading and the elves shall fade, right? And of course, we're used to this fading business with elves, but it's a lot more graceful by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, it seems, right? It's like, it's kind of sad. It's a little bit melancholy, right? But it's not like death or something. But here, it's so was that the way that he was thinking of it all along? I think that's really interesting. So that's eye opener number 1. Eye opener number 2 is this direct competition between men and elves. Now we have seen something like this in the Book of Lost Tales, as Christopher points out, but just that taking the goodness of earth, right? That it's as a consequence, not just of the presence of men, like as men grew more numerous, the elves diminished. Remember, there was even like a mathematical business in the Book of Lost Tales. Like, elves could not thrive in a place where there were as many, like more men as, when the total number of men exceeds the total number of elves. It was a pretty definite sort of, ratio that had to be maintained in order for the elves to thrive. But here, this sense of active competition. Men are growing strong and they're taking the goodness of the earth. They're in direct competition. The elves are fading, which is like a kind of mortality, because of the men. And then the third eye-opener, needing the light of the trees. Really? Like, in what sense? That's, as Christopher points out in the commentary, that's completely new. He's never said that before, right? What did he mean? And again, remember, this is a summary. Like, he's just like, I'm just going to give some background information for him to understand this. And he throws out this little gem. For the elves needed the light of the trees. Really? So outside of Valinor, they were languishing? I mean, in like post-Ungoliant, they're all doomed? It's interesting. I mean, I'm not quite sure what to make of that even, really. But it obviously suggests a kind of intrinsic connection between the elves and Valinor. It makes me want to wonder, like, what about pre-Valinor? What about if they hadn't come over? Did the elves who never came over, have they been suffering this whole time because they never got to see the trees? What's up with that? I don't even really know. But anyway, it's all pretty cool. Okay, so, like I said, it's another thing I like about the sketch, and we'll see a couple of things like this in the Quenta as well. But I love these little kind of nuggets that sort of pop up, and you just sort of find this thing that sort of shows, or at least gives some kind of tantalizing sense of where Tolkien was on this concept, in this case, the fading of elves, at this point. Tom, yeah, it does say somewhere that the elves began to fade with the rising of the sun and the awakening of men. In the published Silmarillion, it says something like that, that the years of the sun are sort of swifter than the slow years of in Valinor, and that all in Middle-earth begins, like, basically sort of like mortality increases, the pressure of mortality increases, and the elves diminish and decline. But see, that's that kind of graceful fading, right? Yes, they will fade, but anyway, yeah. Yeah, and Josh, absolutely. It certainly makes the Silmarils far more important, absolutely. Yeah, what are they now, like elvish life support, right, in Middle-earth? I mean, wow. But anyway, good. But I'm moving on, because, like, efficiency, that's my middle name. That's what the E stands for. Just kidding. But anyway, okay, Ulmo's message to Turgon. Here's another one of those moments where we get the story. Now, this is a story like we've seen before, but again, really interesting to see where Tolkien's mind is here with the story of Gondolin. And as we begin, this is the first one of the passages I want to look at, as we begin to try to sort of figure out the end game of the first age of Middle-earth and where the Silmarillion ends up here in the sketch. Tuor lingers long in the sweet land Nantathrin, the Valley of Willows, but there Ilmir himself comes up the river to visit him and tells him of his mission. That is Tuor's mission, not Ilmir's, presumably. He is to bid Turgon prepare for battle against Morgoth, for Ilmir will turn the hearts of the Valar to forgive the gnomes and send them succor. If Turgon will do this, the battle will be terrible, but the race of orcs will perish and will not in after ages trouble elves and men. Okay, so first of all, hang on a second here. So plan A, right? Ilmir's plan A. This is what Tuor is to tell. Okay, Turgon, he's supposed to prepare for war. Meanwhile, so he's gonna set out and attack Morgoth. Meanwhile, Ulmo is basically, so he's telling me, he's like, I promise, I'm going to turn the hearts of the Valar to forgive the gnomes and send them succor, right? So this is going to be coordinated, like we're, it's like Ulmo is going to take down the shield generator around the Death Star while Turgon goes out, right? That's kind of the plan here, right? So Ilmir is going to go back and he's going to turn the hearts of the Valar, right? But this is insane. But meanwhile, so Turgon, don't wait for it, right? Don't wait for word that the Valar are with you. Just go, right? Go into battle. Trust me, I'm going to be right there behind you with all the rest of the Valar. They're going to forgive the gnomes. It's going to be awesome. They're going to send you succor. So don't worry about it. And if you do, it's going to be a bad battle. I admit it. But the race of orcs will perish and will not in after ages trouble elves and men. So there's going to be a lot of suffering in the short term, but it's going to end the conflict, right? It's going to be over. Or plan B. If not, the people of Gondolin are to prepare for flight to Sirion's mouth, where Ilmir will aid them to build a fleet and guide them back to Valinor. Really? So remember, they've been sending people and it's not been working, but that's okay. Olmo says, I'll make a fleet and I'm going to draw you. Remember how the elves are drawn over in the first place, right? On an island, right? And then they're drawn with boats, the still called Solocimpi, I think, in the sketch. Anyway, are brought over afterwards and pulled in the boats by the swans, right? So, okay. And so Ilmir, he's gonna make a fleet and he's going to bring the people of Gondolin over to Valinor and presumably get them entrance, presumably not going to lead them all to shipwreck in the Magic Isles. At least I hope that's not Ilmir's plan. Okay, right, so that's plan B, right? Plan B is the fleet. If Turgon does Ilmir's will, so plan A, Tuor is to abide a while in Gondolin and then go back to Hithlum with a force of gnomes and draw men once more into alliance with the elves. For without men, the elves shall not prevail against the orcs and the Balrogs. So we get a pretty good view of Plan A here, right? Plan A. Turgon sets off with the Gondolindrum. Hooray! We're going to attack Morgoth. Meanwhile, Tuor, you go with some of the gnomes, right? Some of the Gondolindrum, presumably, and you go over to Hithlum and set all the humans free. Remember, all the men are being penned up in Hithlum, and have been for a long time. So he's going to go and he's going to rally all of the men. And so all the men are going to come. So we've got the Gondolindrum coming in and attacking Melko, and then the men are going to come in, and then Ulmo says, ta-da, the cavalry is going to arrive, and from Valinor are going to come the Valar, like, I forgive you, we're coming to smite Melkor on your behalf, and it's going to be great, right? That's Plan A. Plan B is I'll take you all away in a fleet. Josh, this is a question truly to be asked. Josh Ramsey says, if he could turn the hearts of the Valar, why didn't he do it before? Josh, is exactly what I'm thinking. Like, okay, so, like, Ilmir, why are you going to wait? And I mean, if it's just in your power and now, I mean, the only way, Josh, that it makes any sense at all to me is if basically the whole premise of Ilmir's appeal to the rest of the Valar is going to be like, look at my man Turgon here, right? There he is. They're putting their necks out right now. We got to, so he can't. He's not going to be able to gain their sympathy and stir them to action unless Turgon is like in the field, right? And Tuor is rallying the men, right? If this is all like in the middle of things, then it's totally going to work. And yeah, Josh, I agree. If this sounds like the Nirnaeth Arnoediad to you, it kind of does to me too. Except it's like the battle of unlimited joy instead of the battle of unnumbered tears. It would totally, okay, well, not unlimited joy. It's going to be bad, but again, long term, it's going to be good. It's going to totally be worth it. So yeah, that's plan A. But plan B is the fleet. So this is kind of remarkable. Remember, compare this to the published Silmarillion. Remember Ulmo's message? Ulmo sends a message in the published Silmarillion, right? Remember Ulmo's message in the published Silmarillion? His message is, run away, right? Leave Gondolin now. It's just like basically a message of doom. Gondolin is doomed. It is going to be destroyed very soon. If you don't leave, you will die. This is your last chance for any of you to escape, right? And Turgon's like, nah, right, forget about it. Turgon, you have to admit, is put into a tighter spot in this first one, right? That is to say, what Ulmo is asking of him is much bigger. He has to make, and we talked about this when we talked about the Lost Tales, because that element of the message was similar. He has to make a big leap of faith. And for those of you who weren't here, I'll repeat this because it meant so much to me when I first figured it out finally. If you remember that bit in the published Silmarillion, when it talks about Turgon and why Morgoth is obsessed with Turgon, right? When Turgon is, so Morgoth is almost won, only Gondolin is left, but he's just like, I must destroy Turgon. And it's kind of like, dude, why are you so obsessed with Turgon? Like, yeah, okay, like you haven't gotten 100% of the elves, but like you pretty much won. What's the problem? And the problem is not that he's so obsessed. The problem is the fact that the narrative explains it. But the explanation didn't seem to explain, as somebody else said. That is, it flashes back to say, even while in Valinor, when Turgon walked by, Morgoth felt a chill in his heart, knowing sort of sensing that through Turgon, his doom would come upon him, right? And I always found that a really tantalizing line in the published Silmarillion. And in the context of the published Silmarillion, the only conclusion that you can really come to is that he's talking about Eärendil, right? Since Eärendil is Turgon's grandson, and Eärendil's the guy who's going to go back and tell the Valar, and that's going to lead the Valar to come back, and they're going to overthrow Morgoth. Therefore, through Turgon, his doom will come. And it's like, well, that's kind of indirect. I mean, yeah, doom kind of comes, and Turgon is kind of indirectly involved, but, that's not exactly like Turgon shall be your doom, precisely, right? So that always kind of bothered me. Like, again, I loved that line, but the actual fulfillment of it seemed kind of weak. But then once I finally read the history of Middle-earth and I saw these texts that we're looking at both now and in the previous classes, I realized, okay, of course, that's a holdover, right? That business about, like, Turgon shall be his doom comes from back in the day here where Turgon was going to be his doom, right? Turgon was going to be the general who leads the army, who comes out and attacks and destroys him. So yes, Turgon is directly going to be the one who will bring about his downfall. So that always was a little bit satisfying. But all right, so we see sort of where things are headed. But of course, it doesn't pan out, right? We've got almost plan A and almost plan B, and Turgon chooses C, none of the above, right? I'm fine. I'm just going to hang out in Gondolin, and then almost everybody's going to be destroyed. And Eärendil, escapes, of course, with Tuor, and, well, Eärendil escapes with Tuor. Eärendil's a little kid, right? But he brought his dad with him, so that was fine, and his mom, and they end up down, of course, in the mouths of Sirion. So we end up with our refugee situation, again, as in the published Silmarillion, as we were sort of rather expecting. Then we get to the point, finally, of the adventures of Eärendil. All right. This, of course, like I mentioned before, this was like the most frustrating bit in the Book of Lost Tales. And now, here it is, right? We get Eärendil's adventures in a linear narrative. This is so awesome. Tuor, growing old, cannot forbear the call of the sea, and builds Eärame and sails west with Idril, and is heard of no more. Eärendil weds Elwing. Remember all that stuff before about, like, in the B text, Eärendil builds a second boat in which to go and search for his father, but it's not the same boat as the other. Remember all that stuff? Oh, so glad to be done with that. All right, I won't even refer to it anymore. Tuor builds Eärame and sails west with Idril and is heard of no more. That's lovely. Eärendil weds Elwing. The Call of the Sea is born also in... I didn't think about this before, but it almost suggests he was like, as soon as mom and dad leave, he marries Elwing. Like, did they not approve of her or something, right? Was this like they have to wait till he's out of the picture? Anyway, okay, sorry. The Call of the Sea is born also in him. He builds Wingelot and wishes to sail in search of his father. Ilmir bids him to sail to Valinor. Here follow the marvelous event. Now, I defy you. I defy you to tell me what's Ulmo's plan now. That shrewd strategist Ulmo, what's he up to here? Okay, Ilmir bids him to sail to Valinor. Here follow the marvelous adventures of Wingelot in the seas and isles, and of how Eärendil slew Ungoliant in the south. He returned home and found the waters of Sirion desolate. The sons of Fëanor, learning of the dwelling of Elwing and the Naglafring, had come down on the people of Gondolin. In a battle, all the sons of Fëanor, save Maedhros, were slain, but the last folk of Gondolin destroyed or forced to go away and join the people of Maedhros. Elwing cast the Naglafring into the sea and leapt after it, but was changed into a white seabird by Ilmir and flew to seek Eärendil, seeking about all the shores of the world. Okay. All right. Adam Page says, here follow the marvelous adventures. Reminds me of Aragorn's history. Yeah. Now, by the way, remember, Maglor does come back. Right, that it's almost right away. Like in a penciled note on this passage, Tolkien's like Maedhros and Maglor, right? So Maglor does still live. He changes his mind about having it be only Maedhros almost immediately. But anyway, okay. One thing to notice. if you remember any of those, or not just the fragments, but the projections of the story of Earendil, you may remember that there was going to be like 7 whole separate like days worth of stories about Earendil, that had he actually written what he seemed to be projecting at the time, the Book of Lost Tales was going to be like the, everything from the music of the Ainur through the fall of Gondolin, i.e. the prelude to Earendil, and then the many adventures of Earendil, which was going to be practically as long as the entire Book of Lost Tales up to that point. And you may also remember when we looked at the fall of Gondolin story in the Book of Lost Tales, which, as you recall, was probably the first of the stories that he wrote. And remember, we were looking at those passages when it talks about Earendil and Earendil's coming, and the sort of flagrantly messianic error of those passages, right? And then came the child, the one who was to come. I mean, like, it made such a big, among like the trumpets blowing at the birth of Earendil, made it sound like this is the turning point of all of Middle-earth, right? I mean, this is like, everything, all of world history was a preamble to the birth of Earendil, and his actual career seemed a little disappointing after that huge buildup. But again, that was in a sense justified by the fact that he was going to be basically the protagonist of the history, right? I mean, he was going to get as much screen time as everybody else put together had already gotten. So one thing that we can see in the sketch, that's gone, right? Yes, of course, this is only a summary, but it seems to me, I cannot imagine that the writing out of this, that this summary, that one sentence, here follow the marvelous adventures of Wingalot in the seas and isles, and of how Earendil slew Ungoliant in the south, that one sentence is Tolkien's summary for, like another whole, like 7 enormous stories worth. I don't believe it. It sounds to me, based on this summary, that Tolkien has already shrunk that Earendil is now taking his place within the mythology, rather than being, sort of the crown jewel, the crown prince of the mythology here. Anyway, yeah. So Adam has a good question. Did he posit these numerous and varied background stories before, not because he ever intended to write them, but solely to give an air of an expansive mythology? Well, I mean, in the context, it's not like he was doing it publicly or anything. I mean, it wasn't like that is he wasn't trying to. I mean, because you're right that he certainly does say things like this to kind of give the perception of depth, right? Oh, and there are countless stories out there, but I don't have time to tell you all of them. That kind of thing is exactly a kind of thing that he would do, and it's awesome when he does that kind of thing. But that's not the context of those other passages in the Book of Lost Tales. I mean, it's just like notes to himself about what he plans to write. So I think it seems from the Lost Tales that he actually really did mean to do that. But he never got to. Adam, here, that sentence here sounds exactly like what you're suggesting. That now the epic of Earendil, which he seemed like he was thinking about writing, now I don't believe he does anymore intend to write the epic of Earendil, and instead all of that stuff is compressed to a single sentence which gives the perception of depth. And Earendil had lots and lots of adventures, and he only mentions the one and the most important one, that he kills Ungoliant in the south. And that's been an adventure of Earendil's pretty much all the way along. Okay. So yeah, and one is even tempted to wonder, was the Epic of Earendil that concept of like and that's my phrase, by the way. Tolkien didn't say that, so don't call it that officially. That's just me being a little bit flippant. But the huge sort of anthology of Earendil stories that he seemed to at least want to write, or thought he should write, or whatever. Perhaps was weighing on him somewhat, and he never got around to it. And the more I think about it, the more this seems to me like a perfectly Tolkienian kind of thing. Like, this sounds like Tolkien over and over. This sounds so much like Tolkien that I could totally, I have no idea if this is what happened, but I could absolutely very easily believe that this is what happened. Remember that his mythology begins with Eärendil, right? The name of Eärendil, and he starts writing poems about Eärendil, the wandering star. I can totally imagine that he writes the Book of Lost Tales. Now, like in Tolkien's mind, when he set out to write the Book of Lost Tales, it was all a preamble to Eärendil, right? He had the Eärendil, had this Eärendil person with the star and everything. But he had to tell stories to contextualize it, right? He couldn't just go and start writing stories about Eärendil, right? Because he needed to contextualize it and tell the whole background leading up to it, and then he could finally tell the Eärendil story that he wanted to tell, right? So then as he does this, it kind of grows and grows until it's like the entire, Book of Lost Tales. And then when he finally finishes the preamble and the setup and gets to the story that he really wants to tell, he gets bogged down and can't anymore and doesn't do it. That seems to me, I could so believe that was exactly how it happened. I don't know, no idea, but I could see it happening that way. Anyway, okay. So Eärendil's story. He has his adventures now. Okay, so let's keep careful track of this. He goes home. He finds everybody's gone, most of them dead, right? The disaster has happened, kinslaying number 3 has happened. Elwing is gone, not dead. Notice she's cast out the Silmaril. Her Silmaril is lost. The Silmaril attached to the Naglif ring is at the bottom of the sea somewhere. Hey, wait, doesn't that mean Ulmo has it? Yeah, well, he's not giving it up. So it's gone. So is Elwing. Apparently, though she's changed into a white seabird by Ilmir, this is presumably to spare her life, and yet he doesn't hang on to her or anything. She's off wandering, finding him, and he comes back to find her gone. That already seems, kind of tragic. Meanwhile, of course, we have to pause for a moment in looking at Eärendil's story to note the momentous event which just happened right here in the middle of the sketch, or near the end of the sketch of the mythology. Elrond is born. Elrond the half-elfin. He's still half-elfin, sadly, but this is indeed the birth moment of the Elrond character. So that's kind of exciting. Their son Elrond, who is half mortal and half elfin, a child, was saved, however, by Maedhros. When later the elves return to the west, bound by his mortal half, he elects to stay on Earth. Bound by his mortal half, he elects to stay on Earth. And that's very interesting. The word bound there. Like, if he elects, then in what sense is he bound? That is does his mortal half, call to him? And because he's, in touch with his mortal side, he chooses to stay on Earth rather than going to Elvenhome? That's the best way I can understand it. Though that combination of bound and elects in the same sentence I find kind of interesting. Through him, the blood of Húrin, his great-uncle, and of the elves is yet among men, and is seen yet in valor, and in beauty, and in poetry. Okay, good. So again, this is the origin of Elrond. I have to say, this is one thing that I found a little puzzling. I'm always very reluctant to say that it seems like Christopher Tolkien is wrong about anything, because he knows these texts so much better than I do, than anybody does, and even than his father did, because of course his father didn't look through them all as much as he did. So, I hate to, but Christopher Tolkien emphasizes in his commentary that he thinks it's very significant that we see Elrond, at the moment when Elrond is introduced, the idea of him being given a choice about his fate is also, right there with him, that element of the choice of the half-elven seems to be, or half-elfin, sorry, in this case, seems to be sort of, connected to the story from the beginning. But I would say, sort of. I mean, he's choosing his fate in the sense of he's choosing whether to go or to come back, but not his fate in terms of whether he's going to be an elf or a man. That doesn't seem to be exactly I mean, at least I don't see it. he elects to stay on the earth. Does that mean that he's choosing his mortal half in the sense of becoming mortal? Maybe, but it's not real clear to me. So I'm a little skeptical, I guess, of that. Anyway, no Elros, Cheryl. He is not yet. Which, Cheryl, might be sort of less shocking than you think, or rather, thinking about this a different way. Elros, of course, is the first king will become the first king of Numenor. Elros's absence here suggests an answer to a kind of chicken and egg question that you might ask about Elros. That is, Elrond has a twin brother, Elros, who chose to become mortal and become the first king of the Númenóreans. So, which comes first, Elrond or Numenor? That is to say, is this a story? Do we have any sense? Does the story of this noble line of kings with Elrond's twin brother as their first king, does Elros come first and kind of beget that idea, or is Elros created in order to provide a king for this? And it seems that the latter is the case, right? Elros isn't there at the beginning. We will see Numenor come into being. Much more on that. There's much more on that in Volume 5, of course, than in Volume 4. But so we will see Numenor come about, and they will need a king. But it's not. It certainly doesn't come about as a way to dispose of Elrond's twin, because Elrond does not have a twin. So Elrond is the child, the one vessel through which the blood of Húrin and of the elves and of the divine race, so of Melian as well, comes among men. Also, I can't help but remember that line in The Hobbit describing Elrond. It says that in those days there were still those who had the blood both of elves and of heroes of old in their veins, and of these Elrond was their chief. Elrond being the chief of them still doesn't make any sense, because he's like the chief of himself, right? I mean, he's a one-man gang as far as he's the only one who has the blood of the heroes of old and of elves in his veins. So he's got nobody to be chief of, which is why I still... That more than anything is why the Hobbit Elrond just doesn't seem quite right to be exactly this Elrond. That's a story for another time. Point is, that phrasing in The Hobbit, especially the heroes of old, right? The heroes of the men of old. Húrin, of course it's Húrin. Húrin is the uber hero of humankind, and so of course we single him out particularly. Well, yes, Yana, his kids would have that blood too, but to say, I mean, if you're talking about his family, you'd say he was the father of them, or you'd talk about his family. You wouldn't be like that, that he's the chief. It makes it sound like he's got a clan of people of his kind, right? Not just that, he's got a couple kids and they do too. But anyway, okay, sorry. Okay. All right. Back to Eärendil, though. However, we've interrupted this story to talk about Elrond. Now back to Eärendil. So, okay, he came home. His wife is gone. He's looking for his wife. He's now desolate. No Silmaril. His wife is a seabird looking around for him. He sets off for Valinor. Remember, Olmo said, hey, you should go to Valinor, right? He comes to the Magic Isles and to the Lonely Isle and at last to the Bay of Faerie. Eärendil, mightiest mariner of song, has made it through the Magic Isles, and he's back to Valinor. All right, he climbs the hill of Kor and walks in the deserted ways of Tún, and his raiment becomes encrusted with the dust of diamonds and jewels. He dares not go farther into Valinor. So he gets to Valinor, the first person of any kind to return alive to Valinor, with the possible exception of Luthien if she went across the grinding ice or something and went to the halls of Mandos, but never mind. Point is, he climactically, the mightiest mariner, gets there, and what happens? Nothing at all. It's empty. Now, You remember, it's empty. There's that anticlimactic moment in the published Silmarillion, too, right? He comes to Tyrion upon Tuna. He comes to Tyrion. I'm sorry, I've been listening to the Silmarillion, so I have, like, Martin Shaw in the brain. Anyway, he comes to Tyrion upon Tuna, and it's empty, right? But remember, in the published Silmarillion, it's only temporarily empty. They're just out, right? You know, they're just like, they hung up the gone fishing sign, but they're still there. They're just at the festival, right? Presumably, if he had any sleuthing skills, he could see that they were intending to come back, right? But no. Remember, Toon is now, like, empty. Nobody lives there anymore. They're all gone. All of them are gone. Every singular one, because remember, not only most of them left, and so Toon, already the not yet Vanyar, now still, Kendi still, I think, in the sketch. Again, I'm all messed up with my nomenclature. The Kendi, those who will be eventually the Vanyar, have already left, right? And just the Noldoli are left, but then most of them leave with Fëanor, and a few of them come back, but then all of them leave when they go to fight the war against Morgoth. So they're gone, and he comes back and finds the place deserted, and he wanders around the empty city and goes away, apparently having spoken to no one and done nothing and accomplished nothing. He builds a tower on an isle in the northern seas. Now again, so wait, what was Olmo's plan? Olmo said go to Valinor. Why? What was he supposed to do in Valinor? And okay, he builds a tower on an isle in the northern seas to which all the seabirds of the world repair. Oh, that's convenient. His wife is a seabird, so maybe she'll come. We're set up for a happy ending. He sails by the aid of their wings, even over the airs in search of Elwing. Okay, so he flies. We're used to Eärendil flying, but he's flying. He's being towed by birds, right? Which I don't know if your childhood was anything like mine. This makes you try not to think about James and the Giant Peach, but it's like that, right? So he's being towed by birds. In some sense, I guess, by the aid of their wings. That's how I understand it anyway. Even over the airs in search of Elwing, but is scorched by the sun and hunted from the sky by the moon, and for a long while he wanders the sky as a fugitive star. So Eärendil is just a tragic hero, then, I guess. He came back and he found his wife, or didn't find it, was looking for his wife, didn't find his wife, said, okay, I'll go on this desperate quest to Valinor, succeeded and yet accomplished nothing, finding it deserted, built an island, made an acquaintance with a lot of seabirds who you think might have heard something about his wife, but no, they help him to look, but he doesn't seem to look. And not only does he not, or he does seem to look, not only does he seem to find her, not only does he not seem to find her, but he gets scorched by the sun and hunted by the moon and is wandering around the sky as a fugitive star. Karita asks, why is the moon hunting him? What an excellent question. It seems to be hunting him because that's what it does. The moon is just a hunter. I mean, the guy who drives the moon used to hang out with Orome. He likes hunting, right? He doesn't need an excuse. Yeah, and Kate, Neville, you're right. There is a little of Icarus in there, it seems. I mean, of course, it's not this. The moral of the story certainly doesn't seem to be the same. But yeah, kind of remembers. Yeah. Anyway, so it's. Yeah, Gwendolyn says, why is it that Eärendil is not punished by the Valar since he doesn't have the Silmaril? Gwendolyn, it's not even obvious that the Valar even knew he was there. Right? It's like worse than that. It's like, how anticlimactic is Eärendil's trip to Valinor in this sense? But now keep in mind, again, those of you who did the Lost Tales with me will remember that happened. Him going there and just giving up and wandering away. That was in the fragmentary bits that we saw. This is not a new thing. Eärendil's story being a tragic story, and in a couple versions of the earlier fragments and things, he was like never going to find Elwing, right? So the fact that he ends in sadness, and why is he in the sky? Why has Earendel become a fugitive star? Well, he's become a fugitive because he's being chased by the moon and scorched by the sun. But he's become a star just to try to find his wife, right? Like get a better vantage point, I suppose, for searching for his wife. Anyway, yeah. So this is our story, and now we come to the last battle. Okay, I'm tempted to call it the last battle. Morgoth is thrust through the door of night into the outer dark beyond the walls of the world, and a guard set forever on that door. The lies that he sowed in the hearts of men and elves do not die, and cannot all be slain by the gods, but live on and bring much evil even to this day. Some say also that secretly Morgoth or his black shadow in spirit, in spite of the Valar, creeps back over the walls of the world in the north and east and visits the world. Others that this is Thu, the great chief who escaped the last battle and dwells still in dark places. Ah, right here we see the germ of the Lord of the Rings already, right? The seed of the Lord of the Rings has been planted in that sentence. When the world is much older and the gods weary, Morgoth will come back through the door, and the last battle of all will be fought. Fionwe will fight Morgoth on the plain of Valinor, and the spirit of Turin shall be beside him. That's right, the spirit of Turin shall be beside him. It shall be Turin who with his black sword will slay Morgoth, and thus the children of Hurin shall be avenged. Yeah, exactly, Josh. It's the germ of the necromancer. So if that sentence is the seed from which the Lord of the Rings will grow, the reference to the necromancer and his dark tower in The Hobbit is like the little green shoot, right, that's coming up out of the soil when you can't really quite tell what kind of plant it's going to be yet. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yeah, Josh, don't ask me to explain where Turin's ghost has been and why it's come back. I don't know. All I can say is he's Hurin's son, man, and Hurin is like the... more than anything else, Josh, the main conclusion I come to here, I'm trying not to think of the metaphysics of this, because the metaphysics, Tolkien makes no gesture at explaining the metaphysics of what on earth is going on with the spirit of Turin here. Okay, so if he's not going to make a gesture, I'm not going to make a gesture at it. I don't know. But sort of thematically, anyway, this makes a certain amount of sense. The story of the children of Hurin, one of the ways in which I have kind of understood that story for a long time has been as essentially the quintessential human story. It's one of the only stories. I mean, yes, there is an elf in it. I mean, there are elves who are involved in that story, but that story is more focused upon humans and the destiny of humans than any other story in the Silmarillion. I mean, like, Beren and Luthien is about mortality too. Mortality creeps up in a bunch of places, but the story of the children of Hurin seems to me the one which is primarily primarily focused upon the situation of humans in the world. It's a little depressing, of course. It's not quite the most cheerful way of thinking about the role of human life in the world, the sort of the state of humanity on Earth. But nevertheless, that seems to me sort of what that story kind of does. So the way, in this sense, thinking about this, Josh, not asking myself the metaphysical question about the destiny of Turin's own personal soul, but rather thinking about this in a sort of a quasi-symbolic sense, that it is in a sense, symbolically anyway, fitting that Turin should be the one who comes back and slays Morgoth, that evil is going to be destroyed. Okay, so think big picture here for a second. Evil is eventually going to be destroyed. And it shall be a man, a human being, who destroys him. And not just any man, but Turin, the one who is sort of like the symbol for humanity persecuted and screwed over by evil, right? He's the one who, having messed up everything, and also of like ineptitude and arrogance, right? Having messed up everything and had everything gone against him, having been born under a doom which he could not escape, and which, you know, really gave him a pretty bad situation in his life. Nevertheless, he's the one who's going to come back, and it is his hand that is going to destroy Morgoth. There's a kind of symbolic beauty in that particular choice, talking about sort of like the redemption of humanity and the way in which sort of doomed humanity will itself become the instrument that is used for the ultimate destruction of Morgoth. That's kind of nice, actually. That he, Adam says Turin is the archetype of sinful man needing redemption. In a sense, yeah, but I would also add, Adam, there is that redemptive element, certainly, but it's not just redemption. It's also the fact that he himself will strike the blow, right? He is not only the lost who is to be redeemed, he is also the instrument that is going to be used. Yeah. So anyway, I think that there's it's, if you don't fret about the details, it's kind of nice. It's kind of lovely. But here's where my head starts to hurt. Okay, so this is the last battle of all. So this is the total end of the world. This is apocalypse we're talking about here, right? At least that's what I'm understanding. So, okay, keep that in mind. Moving on. Almost done with last week. Okay, in those days, back to Eärendil. In those days, the Silmarils shall be recovered from sea and earth and air, and Maedhros shall break them, and Belauran, that is Pelurian, that is Yavanna, with their fire rekindle the two trees, and the great light shall come forth again, and the mountains of Valinor shall be levelled, so that it goes out over the world. That is, so that the light goes out over the world, presumably not the mountains, nor Valinor, the antecedent of it. A little bit unclear there. And gods and elves and men shall grow young again, and all their dead awake. Of men and elves, presumably, not the gods. Remember, he crosses men out there in pencil in a revision. And thus it was that that is, the gods and the elves shall grow young again, and all their dead awake again, presumably of the elves, not the gods, as few of them have died. And thus it was that the last Silmaril came into the air. The last Silmaril. So remember, Christopher Tolkien went over this very carefully, but let's recap. Silmaril number 1 is lost that is Beren and Lúthien's Silmaril, chucked into the ocean by Elwing. Gone, right? Bottom of the ocean, sort of, eventually. Shallowly. But anyway, whatever. It's in the ocean, right? Leaving 2 Silmarils on the Iron Crown of Morgoth. Those are taken from the Iron Crown by Fionwe when Morgoth is overthrown. Not overthrown and stabbed by Turin. That's at the final battle at the end of the world, but rather at the battle in the War of Wrath. Fionwe overthrows Morgoth, and he's shoved headfirst into outer darkness. And his Iron Crown is taken, beaten into a collar for his neck, and the Silmarils recovered. Those are the 2 Silmarils, right? So we got the 1 in the ocean, 2 in the hands of Fionwe. Maglor steals one of them, right? And Maglor gets burned by it and chucks it into the fiery hole in the earth. So 1 is in the fire, 1 is in the ocean, 1 is still in the possession of Fionwe, right? The Valar still have the 1. That's the one that they give to Eärendil, right? So they say, hey, let's let Eärendil have this last one. So so it's not the Silmaril of Beren and Lúthien that Eärendil has on his brow in this version of the story. And thus it was that the last Silmaril came into the air. The gods adjudged the last Silmaril to Eärendil until many things shall come to pass. Okay. So That's a little vague, to say the least, but it suggests there's lots more story to come. Not that he's going to tell it, right? But this is not an end-of-the-world thing, right? So this is clearly there's a lot of time. So when we talk about the last battle in the end, this is not the end, right? This is after the War of Wrath, but there's still a lot of world to go on. Many things are going to come to pass, and he's got the Silmaril anyway. Because of the deeds of the sons of Fëanor. Okay, it's because of their deeds, they give the Silmaril. They take them away from the sons of Fëanor, who can't have nice things, and they give it to Eärendil. Maedhros is sent to Eärendil, and with the aid of the Silmaril, Elwing is found and restored. Nice to see Maedhros contributing constructively. Eärendil, so and no, let me not pass over. Happy ending, right? Eärendil finds Elwing. That's lovely. Okay, so it was looking bad, right? Like she was flying in the form of a seabird, and she was looking for him, and he was looking for her, and they were not finding each other, but they are going to be reunited. How lovely. Okay. Wait, where are we? We were. Eärendil's boat is drawn over Valinor to the outer seas, and Eärendil launches it into the outer darkness high above sun and moon. That's a happy ending too, right? No more being plagued by the sun and hunted by the moon. Fantastic. There he sails with the Silmaril upon his brow and Elwing at his side, the brightest of all stars. It makes it sound like Elwing is the brightest of all stars, which is cute. Keeping watch upon Morgoth. So he shall sail until he sees the last battle gathering upon the plains of Valinor. Then he will descend. Okay, so he's up there in the sky now until the end of the world. Apocalypse. Last battle, right? So Turin's spirit comes back from wherever it's been and fights Morgoth, and Eärendil descends. Then he will descend. That's kind of lovely, right? Okay. Roy is wondering if he has a front row seat to the last battle, right? When Turin returns and stabs Morgoth, Eärendil wants to see that thing up close. Okay. Right. All right. So last point, and then we'll move on from the sketch. The very end of the sketch is fascinating, and I didn't necessarily see it coming. Okay, I didn't at all see it coming, and doubly do I not see it coming. And this is the last end of the tales of the days before the days in the northern regions of the Western world. Okay. This is the last end of the tales of the days before days in the north. So, does that mean this is all ancient history? So, but some of it hasn't happened yet? Is some of it prophecy? This is one of the things when I was talking about the last battles, one of the things that's a little bit unclear. Again, if you remember the Lost Tales, you'll remember that the frame story gets caught up in the narrative itself, like the faring forth and the stuff with elves and men in Britain and all that kind of thing. So, the end of, the final end of the whole trajectory of the mythology was not apocalypse, was not the end of the world. It was the end of those days, which led up to the current status quo of, the domination, the dominion of men, in which we are currently living. If I understand the sketch properly, in that when it says the last battle, it really means the last battle, and we're talking about the end of the entire world, the apocalypse. In other words, that stuff is a prophecy of the future. Then I assume that then would be accepted. I mean, it's not. It doesn't make it clear. The sketch. It's not obvious that and it is said that someday, that is in the future tense from when you, reader, are reading this, right? But again, part of that is, remember, this is not a literary text. It's just a summary. So maybe if we were getting this in a more literary fashion, we would perceive that distinction more clearly. Hey, let's pay attention to that when we get there in the Quenta. Moving on. Okay. These tales are some of those remembered and sung by the fading elves, and most by the vanished elves of the Lonely Isle. They have been told by elves to men of the race of Eärendil, and most to Ariel, who alone of mortals of later days sailed to the Lonely Isle, and yet came back to Luthien, that is, England, and remembered things he had heard in Cortirion, the town of the elves, in Tol Eressëa. Okay. So the two things. First, the frame story still exists. The frame story of the Lost Tales is that you have this human guy, Ariel, who goes to the Lonely Isle, meets the elves, hears the stories, brings them back to the world, and thus are these stories, begun to circulate within our world, right? The surprise, that's not a surprise, that was the premise, that was the frame of the Book of Lost Tales. The surprise is that it's still there, right? We had no whiff of it before, and with this kind of outline, the fact that he would end the outline by saying, oh, P.S., the frame story still in force, still doing that. That's kind of interesting. It wouldn't necessarily have expected that in this context. Interesting to see he hasn't let that go. Also interesting to see we're back to Ariel, who was the original name of the guy, and then there was all the change to Alfwine, and then everything kind of hit the fan. But Ariel is back, right? So that's interesting. But anyway, okay. Thus do we end with the sketch. Now, it's time to start class. Let's talk about the Quenta. All right. Here's the first point I want to make about the Quenta. I want to make in a simple way. I'm not going to spend a long time talking about this passage. What I do want to do is read the passage and tell me what you notice. So came evil into Valinor. Silpion was waning fast, and Laurelin but just begun to glow, when protected by fate, Morgoth and Ungoliant crept unawares into the plain. With his black sword, Morgoth stabbed each tree to its very core, and as their juices spouted forth, Ungoliant sucked them up, and poison from her foul lips went into their tissues and withered them, leaf and branch and root. Slowly they succumbed, and their light grew dim, while Ungoliant belched forth black clouds and vapors as she drank their radiance. To monstrous form she swelled. Then fell wonder and dismay on all in Valmar, when twilight and mounting gloom came on the land. Black vapors floated about the ways of the city. Varda looked down from Teniquitil, and saw the trees and towers all hidden as in a mist. Too late they ran from hill and gate. The trees died and shone no more, while wailing throngs stood round them, and called on Manwë to come down. Out upon the plain the horses of Oromé thundered with 100 hoofs, and fire started in the gloom about their feet. Swifter than they ran Tulkas on before, and the light of the anger of his eyes was as a beacon. But they found not what they sought. Wherever Morgoth went, a darkness and confusion was around him that Ungoliant made, so that feet were bewildered and search was blind. Wow. The point I want to make is, in a sense, not really a very sublime one. What I'm doing is not... What I want to do with this passage is not close reading, exactly, but, well, close listening. You hear the difference between the Quenta and the sketch? Right? Just listening to this passage. Hear the difference between the sketch and the Quenta? Yeah, Cheryl, exactly. This is no longer a sketch. This is literary. Yeah. What has happened? And keep in mind, I don't know why Tolkien is doing this. That is to say, and Christopher doesn't explain it. It's not obvious that Christopher knows. Christopher doesn't even ask the question in his commentaries anyway. We think about all the other stuff that we've read in these first 4 volumes of the History of Middle-earth so far. And some of them are rather peculiar, but it's at least easy to see what Tolkien is kind of generally doing, right? That is Book of Lost Tales, right? He's writing a cycle of tales, right? Bound together in a frame. And the tales themselves work really well as sort of related tales, which are not... they're not a summary, but they're not novel length and detail and in their narrative style. They're in the style of a kind of an oral performance, and a fairly sort of refined oral performance at that, with very complex syntax and everything. So it's clear what he's setting out to do from a literary standpoint, right? Why he's writing that book. Then after that, he starts writing epic poems, right? I'm going to do an alliterative lay of the children of Hurin. I'm going to do an epic, heroic couplets version of the lay of Lathian. Cool, right? All right, yeah, I get it, right? Epic poem version of these stories. That sounds awesome, right? Okay, I want to explain the context. I'm going to write a sketch, right? I'm going to write a plot summary of the whole thing in order to give this guy the backstory for the alliterative lay of children of Hurin. I totally understand that, right? I get what he's doing and why he's doing it. Why does he write the Quenta? I mean, if you think about it for a second, it's a little odd, don't you think? I've written this plot summary, right? The sketch. What's your next move, right? You've written the sketch of the mythology. What are you going to do now? A couple plans suggest themselves, right? Plan A. I'm going to go back and revise the Book of Lost Tales. Right now, having thought it through again, some changes I want to make. I'm Tolkien, so I'm probably going to start all over again at the beginning, right? But I'm going to go back and do, because I remember he just said at the end of the sketch that was still the plan, right? Frame story and everything. So having the next step when he decides I want to put a little bit more into this, I want to flesh out my mythology more again, right? Again, now it's been a long time. It's been like 15 years since he started the Book of Lost Tales. Now we're in 1930, so again, to say I'm gonna reboot the Book of Lost Tales seems to me a perfectly logical thing for him to do. It's not what he does, right? He's been writing epic poems now for 10 years. The alliterative lay of the children of Hurin, the lay of Lathian. Of course, you'll remember those remember the fragments from the other poems that he began. Sometimes substantial fragments, dozens in some cases, hundreds of lines in other cases. Of things like the flight of the Noldoli and so the others. I'm blanking on the others right now, but anyway, there are a bunch, right? We can see that impulse. So okay, one thing he could do is reboot the Book of Lost Tales. He could write an epic poem or a series of epic poems, right? Why not? That would make sense, right? But no, that's not what he does either. Instead, what he does is he says, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do another summary, except this time I'm going to do a pretty summary, right? I'm just going to flesh out the summary as is in that same kind of, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invest in the plot summary genre, right? And I'm going to transform this plot summary into a gorgeous plot summary and flesh it out a little bit. Is it just me, or does that seem weird? Right? It seems a little strange to do. I think it's a little strange, anyway. A little unexpected in any case. Certainly a departure for Tolkien. But in a way, of course, I mean, for our purposes, thinking about the published Silmarillion that I assume we all know and I assume most of us love, it's a fateful choice. Right, because it's clear that the published Silmarillion is the sort of the linear descendant, not of the Book of Lost Tales, but of the sketch of the mythology and the Quenta. Right. I mean, of course, obviously, it's based on stuff from the Book of Lost Tales, but it is a linear descendant of the sketch. That it's the final flowering of the mythological plot summary genre. Right. And yet, no, Roy, of course you're right that there are a lot of myths that read like that. Well, sort of right, but at least there are collections of myths that read like that. But that's not even what the myths were originally. That is to say, like, yeah, you can find stuff like that, like Apollodorus's collection of Greek mythology, for instance. I used to teach Apollodorus's anthology, Greek anthology, and like it reads like that, but it's artificial. That is, it's not the real myth. It's like a dude just giving summaries of the myths. The real stories are like Homer, right? Like, but either Homer telling the story of Achilles, or Homer telling the story of Odysseus, or Homer digressing in the midst of telling the story of Achilles to tell the story of digressing from the story of Odysseus to tell the story of the time that Hephaestus caught Aphrodite and Ares in a net, right? That's the way that myths tend to get told. So for him to sort of say, yeah, I'm going to just do that kind of a summary, and so I mean, Roy, you're right that it's not totally unprecedented. That kind of thing is not totally unprecedented, but it's a weird direction. It's an unprecedented direction in Tolkien's own experience. So, I mean, anyway, I just think it's really, I think it's a fascinating departure for Tolkien's career, is the main point that I make there. But anyway, yes, this is beautiful. By the way, I think this is way better than the description of the Darkening of Valinor in the published Silmarillion. I love this version of the Darkening of Valinor. I shamelessly included this slide just because I wanted to read it. Because I think, do you hear it though? Hear how he's taken what was bare plot summary and he has given it an almost poetic rhythm, a quite poetic rhythm in places. I mean, listen to, where was I? Oh yes, too late they ran from hill and gate. That could be the line of a song, right? You can hear as he's writing that, like, he's almost slipped into verse. Too late they ran from hill and gate. Too late they ran from hill and gate. It's perfect iambic tetrameter, his favorite meter. Anyway, and you think about the balance, the gorgeous balance of some of these sentences. With his black sword, Morgoth stabbed each tree to its very core, and as their juices sprouted forth, Ungoliant sucked them up, and poison from her foul lips went into their tissues and withered them, leaf and branch and root. I mean, it's so good. Oh, man. So yeah. Yes, good, Josh. You're right with the alliteration. Yeah, we can see him playing again. Not that he's writing alliterative verse, but Josh is pointing out the line. Out upon the plain, the horses of Orome thundered with 100 hooves, and fire started in the gloom about their feet. Yeah, it's not like he's writing alliterative verse, but absolutely, horses, 100 hooves, fire, feet. Right? We can hear that oral effect, right, of the alliteration kind of rumbling around in there. It's really cool. Their feet were bewildered, and search was blind. Notice the balanced phrases emphasized by the alliteration on the B's there. Yeah, I mean, this is Tolkien writing prose in really in what I think of as Tolkien's highest style, not his most complex diction, but in that sense, it's in a lower register than the Book of Lost Tales, which was sort of more archaic in its structure and in its word choice. But with the poetic mellifluence of this prose, this is Tolkien, I think, at his greatest. And you can hear that the delicacy of his ear in sort of weighing the sounds and exploiting the sounds of words and the rhythm of his syntax and everything. So good. Anyway, that to me is this is the difference between the sketch and the Quenta, right? We can talk about, and we will talk about, some of the details of the ways the story is developing and evolving, but that to me pales in comparison to the fact that he's now taking that really simple summary and he's doing it, but he's doing this with it. And can I just say, I called his undertaking of the Quenta here to be a really unusual, really strange one. But can I just say how grateful I am that he did? I mean, if he had done either one of those other two things, that seems so much more likely, right? That is the Book of Lost Tales reboot, or the epic poem version, right? Or series of epic poem versions. The odds that he would have followed through either one of those projects to their end are like zero. He never would have finished. There's no way he would have finished it. He never finished anything like that. But this, so it's like, I don't know. I don't know if this was actually in his mind or what, but it's like he's found a genre in which he can complete a work to its end, right? The plot summary genre is the genre for him when it comes to that. And now he's making it his own. Right now he's making the plot summary genre into, a real literary vehicle for him. And that's really cool. Adam is asking, how would I compare it to his translation of Beowulf? Well, it's hard there. I would be very cautious comparing it sort of detail by detail, mostly because in his translation of Beowulf, he has the sound of Beowulf specifically in his head. And what he's always trying to do, whenever Tolkien does a modern English translation of a Middle English or Old English text, he is trying to convey the feel of the original language, the feel of the original text and poetry. So he's, in that sense, kind of not really doing his own thing. Like Adam, for instance, we wouldn't see him break out into spontaneous iambic tetrameter in the middle of it that same way, because that's not the sound of Beowulf. He would avoid that kind of sound. So it's not that he's doing the same thing, but it's similar in the sense of his paying attention to the sound of sentences. Remember all the jokes that I was making when I was reading those passages from the sketch about like uncertainties in his pronoun antecedents and stuff? That's a product of him just kind of rattling off prose to summarize the stories, right? His language is not really precise, even syntactically, even grammatically not really precise in places, because that's not what he's doing. He's just trying to give the overview. That, of course, has quite shifted around here. But anyway, okay, all right. I will, however, I know several of you, a whole bunch of you were pointing out and were really... sorry, of course, Tom, sorry, I missed it before. Tom Hillman, of course, exactly caught Too Late They Ran from Hill and Gate as iambic tetrameter. I knew you'd recognize that, Tom. Tom Hillman, one of the veterans of my Tolkien's poetry class from last fall, which was so much fun. I knew you'd catch that, Tom. Anyway, okay, so, but as, yes, a point that here, I will comment on the one point, which I too agree with you, found most eye-opening in this particular passage, which is, when protected by fate, Morgoth and Ungoliant crept unawares into the plain. Yes, it is the fate of the trees of Valinor to be destroyed this day. In the published Silmarillion, it is a stratagem, right? Morgoth knows full well, because he lived in Valinor for a long time after his unchaining. He knows full well that today is the day of the great feast of celebration, that everybody's going to be focused over there. Today is the optimal day to sneak into Valmar and take out the trees. That's the story in the published Silmarillion. That is not the story here in the Quenta. In the Quenta, they're just rolling the dice, Morgoth and Ungoliant, trying to sneak in. They're taking the risk, and it pans out for them. Why? They're protected by fate. That this was apparently supposed to go down this way. Now we are told afterwards that there is a festival going on, but here I certainly agree with Christopher Tolkien that it still sounds like a bit of an afterthought. It's never brought up. It's certainly never brought up in the context of Morgoth's own thought process that this is why he's doing it throughout the whole description of the darkening, until he begins talking about what happens after the darkening. It's not until then that he even brings up the fact that there's a festival going on. Okay. Let's go back a bit. Back to the, having done the darkening, let's now go back to the arising of the trees. Remember, we looked at the passage in the sketch that described the trees, and I was really struck, as I was explaining last time, about how detailed the description was, and how the description was rooted, forgive the pun, in recognizable trees, right? It was like a the laurelin was like a laburnum, and silpion was like a cherry, I find it interesting that although certainly they were of mythic significance, the way that they were described there, it went out of its way not to emphasize that they are sort of mythic things first, but like that they were trees first. And Christopher also makes a big deal with which I again completely agree with him, in the fact that it's a big deal. Makes a big deal of the use of the word planted in the sketch, that seems an odd and a significant word. He makes a big deal that it's there in the sketch and that it's gone here in the Quenta. And again, I think he's quite right to point that out. Anyway, in Valinor, Yavanna hallowed the mold with mighty song, and Nienna watered it with tears. The gods were gathered in silence upon their thrones of council in the Ring of Doom, nigh unto the golden gates of Valmar the Blessed. And Yavanna Pelurian sang before them, and they watched. From the earth came forth 2 slender shoots, and silence was over all the world, save for the slow chanting of Pelurian. Under her songs 2 fair trees uprose and grew. Of all things which the gods made, most renown have they, and about their fate all the tales of the world are woven. Dark green leaves had the one, that beneath were as silver shining, and he bore white blossoms like the cherry, from which a dew of silver light was ever falling. And earth was dappled with the dark and dancing shadows of his leaves, amid the pools of gleaming radiance. Leaves of young green like the new opened beech the other bore, their edges were of glittering gold. Yellow flowers swung upon her boughs like the hanging blossoms of the merry trees men now call golden rain, and from those flowers there came forth warmth and a great light. Okay. What do you notice here? In many ways, of course, the details are the same, right? Easy to put the sketch version next to the Quenta version and say, yep, same story, same trees, right? Same general descriptions, right? Cherry, what's golden rain now, right? But the description of the leaf, the fact that laurelin's leaves are like a beech leaf, right? It's all the same. Good. Carita points out the trees are written of as male and female. Yeah, they are much more heavily personified here. Absolutely. And yeah, more poetry, Josh. I agree. Dappled with the dark and dancing shadows. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly right. The golden rain is still laburnum, though. Notice it's using the sort of the more poetic version of the name for the laburnum now, right? Less mundane. It sounds less like. So have you ever seen a laburnum tree? Yeah, it kind of look like that, right? It's the sketch kind of gave that impression. That's not at all the impression that we get here. In fact, if anything, it seems to kind of ripple down the other way, right? Why do men call this particular kind of tree the laburnum golden rain? Is it in some sense because it's like laurelin? Again, he doesn't suggest it, but it seems to almost work that way. Yeah. And you're right, Kate. The gender does correlate with the eventual sun and moon. That is true. So they're more personified. Just notice how the two things sort of happen in correlation with the tonal shift between the sketch and the Quenta. That is, as the language and the diction and the descriptions become more beautiful, more poetic, so the elements within the story also become more mythic, become deeper. Even these are no longer saplings that are being planted, right, by Pelurian or Belarian, but rather they're shoots that spring forth and then almost immediately become personified, right? Yeah. Anyway, good. Mick Neal says, it all reminds me of why I loved the Silmarillion in the first place, the mythic denseness. Yes, exactly. Good. So I think that that too, again, gives a really good glimpse of kind of not just where we are, but where Tolkien is moving us, right? What he's doing now. What is the process right? Going from the sketch to the Quenta, it seems pretty clear the kind of direction that he's going. Oh, what a fascinating observation, Roy. Roy says this is Tolkien's recovery in action. Yeah. You're right, Roy. This is no longer like, it kind of looked like a laburnum, right? But rather, you will never be able to look at a laburnum tree in the same way ever again, right? You will look at cherry blossoms with new eyes this coming spring, right? Yes, it is Tolkien's recovery in action. What a marvelous observation. Okay, another passage. This is another passage I want to just touch on briefly. This is another one of those nuggets of lore passages where he makes reference to something, which I think is really interesting in passing. Morgoth's hordes. In such forests did Orome sometimes hunt, but save Orome and Yavanna the Valar went not out of Valinor, while in the north Morgoth built his strength, and gathered his demon broods about him, whom the gnomes knew after as the Balrogs, with whips of flame. The hordes of the orcs he made of stone, but their hearts of hatred. Glamhoth, the people of hate, the gnomes have called them. Goblins that may they be called, but in ancient days they were strong and cruel and fell. Thus he held sway. So, yes, as I've explained very many times since about 2007, goblins and orcs are in fact exactly the same thing. It's synonyms. Goblins may they be called, right? They are called that. But in those days, they weren't just goblins. They weren't just like the kinds of things that you might meet in, George MacDonald. No. They were strong and cruel and fell. But Arthur, you have hit exactly upon, and Josh as well, and Gwendolyn, all three of you, upon the lore nugget that I wanted to touch on. The hordes of the orcs he made of stone, but their hearts of hatred. Yes. So, you may remember in the published Silmarillion, we are told that Morgoth cannot make new living things. He can only corrupt that which is already made. Not true. We saw in the Book of Lost Tales that this was not true. We saw him make dragons and make orcs out of rock and slime. He's still in the business. 1930 Quenta, Morgoth is still in the business of making orcs, and they are still being made out of stone. But again, that poetic touch. Their hearts of hatred. Presumably, by the way, this still means that Morgoth's own spirit of hatred and malice, that he is investing his own spirit of hatred and malice in the orcs. But it's much nicer to say that he makes their hearts out of hatred. And I've always loved the word Glamhoth. What an awesome name that is. The Glamhoth, the people of hate, the horde of hate. The gang of hate. Anyway, really cool. Anyway, okay, so this is where orcs come from. They're made out of rocks and hatred. They're not yet corrupted elves. We're still nowhere near that origin story for the orcs, but larger, bigger metaphysical point, Morgoth can make stuff, and he manufactures. The orcs are a product of Morgoth's R&D department, not corrupted elves. And Nancy, what's Orome hunting? He's hunting evil beasts that are roaming around in Middle-earth, Morgoth's creatures. Yeah, Tom, doesn't it sound like trolls? It kind of sounds like Tolkien never does completely release this idea. He just shifts it. He just doesn't make it true of the orcs anymore. Arthur asks, somewhat sharply, is that why it's okay to commit genocide against the orcs? Yeah, they're made out of rocks. Exactly. They're not children of Iluvatar. It's not a question of, like, do they have free will? They're not even really living creatures. They are, in this sense, below beasts. They're animated stone. They're rocks animated by hatred and malice. That's all. So, kill them wherever you find them. Put them out of commission, right? Because they're stone, originally stone creatures. Does that mean that orcs have like stony, that like they still are sort of perceptibly made out of stone? No, not necessarily. But that's what they're sort of originally shaped from and adapted from. So yeah, absolutely. But that does seem to explain the sort of cavalier attitude towards slaughter all the orcs. Yeah, Arthur, you're right. Ilmir promised that they would all be exterminated. So yeah. Michael asks, aren't the dwarves also made from earth? Remember in Appendix A, Part 3, the House of Durin, Durin's folk portion of Appendix A, when it talks about the origin of dwarves, and it says, of the origins of dwarves, many strange tales are told, right? But it's not really known where exactly they came from. You know why it's not known where they came from? Because Tolkien never wrote it. He never he never wrote the origin story of dwarves, so he does what he always does in that kind of case. He's always like, yes, among the elven scholars there is much uncertainty and they don't know for sure what the true story may be. He didn't tell it. He doesn't know. He didn't say it. Keep an eye on dwarves, because dwarves, as we see, dwarves are not really good guys yet, and I don't even really think they're fully good guys in The Lord of the Rings. I know that sounds shocking. Thorin's family are, they're decent enough folk if you don't expect too much, but they're an aberration. It's all dwarves aren't like that. Anyway. But the point is, dwarves certainly in 1930, the dwarves are not nice people yet. Which is why Thorin and his friends were kind of uncertain about them, and why Bilbo feels like a bit of an idiot when Smaug tells him you got to watch out for those dwarves, and he's like, oh man, I really should have known. It's one of the reasons why he's quick to believe, or at least partially believe, or worry about what Smaug tells him. There's, as I say, the origin story, but keep in mind, we have no Aule and Yavanna yet, right? There's no story of Aule making the dwarves. That's not there at all yet. No whiff of it in any version that we've gotten to so far. Yes, Gwendolyn, the dwarves are still very Norse. Absolutely. If you're familiar with dwarves in Norse mythology, that seems to be, I feel safe in saying that until he tells us otherwise, we're kind of safe in presuming that they're pretty much like Norse dwarves. Everything I see in the early Silmarillion suggests that that's the case. So if you're familiar with those, that'll kind of help at this point. All right. We're moving right along. We're so getting through everything. All right. Now, the nature of the elves and what's going on with them. All right, let's watch this carefully here. To the other elves, the Valar gave a home and dwelling. So we're talking about the people who will later be called the Vanyar and the gnomes, right? Because even among the tree-lit gardens of the gods, they longed at whiles to see the stars. A gap was made in the encircling mountains, and there in a deep valley that ran down to the sea, the green hill of Kor was raised. From the west the trees shone upon it, to the east it looked out to the Bay of Faery, and the Lonely Isle, and the shadowy seas. Thus some of the blessed light of Valinor came into the lands without, and fell upon the Lonely Isle, and its western shore grew green and fair. There bloomed the first flowers that ever were, east of the mountains of the gods. On the top of Kor, the city of the elves was built, the white walls and towers and terraces of Tun. The highest of those towers was the Tower of Ing, whose silver lamp shone far out into the mists of the sea, but few are the ships of mortals that have ever seen its marvelous beam. There dwelt the elves and gnomes. Elves equals Vanyar, gnomes equals Noldor. So, okay. There are a lot of details in this bit that I find really fascinating. And the kind of question that I'm bringing to it here is, what is the nature of elves? No, that's not really the question. The real question is, to what extent are the Valar screwing up here? That's my real question. It's plain that they are screwing up in bringing the elves to Valinor. The question is, to what extent are the Valar screwing up in what they're doing here? And I think we get several pieces of information relevant to that question in this passage. So they've brought the elves to Valinor, right? They go to the elves and they're like, hey, we think you guys are the greatest. You want to come live with us in like eternal bliss? We have this awesome pad that we've made over here, right? It's great. We think you'll really like it. Come back and live with us where everything is gorgeous and that we have the light of the trees. You're going to love the trees, by the way. And it's, in fact, maybe you'll become dependent upon the trees and wither away and fade and die if you get separated from them. But, let's hope for the best. Anyway, so you should come over, right? Because it's going to be awesome and you'll love it. That's the idea, right? But what do we see? They go over to the awesome place, right? And they are enclosed round about with awesomeness. They are surrounded by perfect bliss. And they're like, it'd be kind of nice to be able to see the stars, actually, right? They need access to Middle-earth, right? For them to be completely walled away from Middle-earth seems to be wrong, seems to be bad. Even when they're there, they long to see the stars, at least at whiles, right? Every once in a while, they long for that, right? So the Valar are like, hey, let's make a gap. Fine, all right. We love you so much. We're gonna leave the door open, right, and let you guys step outside to take a breath of fresh air every now and again. I mean, of less fresh air or something. But anyway, we'll let you go out every now and again. And of course, in saying that, it shows how the light of the trees is being hoarded by the Valar, right? Through the gap, the light comes out, right? And flowers bloom, like accidentally, on the Lonely Isle. And they're the first flowers that ever were east of the mountains of the gods. And it's like, oh, yeah, well, that's kind of nice. You get to share a little bit, even if it wasn't the plan, right? But even then with the tower, right? Ingwe. Ing, who is Ingwe, right? He crosses it out and writes Ingwe all over the place. Ingwe doesn't just live in the city built on the margin, right? So they decide they're not going to live in the middle of Valinor. No, they're going to live on the hill in the valley out facing, with the access to the stars and to the Middle-earth, the place that they left behind in order to come to the super awesome place, right? So they're going to live on the boundary. They can go to the super awesome place or they can look out into the stars. And the fact that Ing, the high king of all of the elves, king of the elves and also king of the elves, never mind. Anyway, point is, he makes a tower which has a light why does he make a lighthouse? Few are the ships of mortals that have ever seen its marvelous beam, right? So it's not like an actually very useful lighthouse, but it's a really interesting symbol. Why does he make a tower that shines a light out into the sea? We don't know why he does, but he did it for some reason or other, right? That is to say, the elves seem to have this Middle-earthwards impulse, right? They want to be able to see out in that direction, to see the stars of Middle-earth. They're even shining this light out towards Middle-earth, kind of like the Valar aren't with their trees behind the walls there in Valinor. And I find this whole thing kind of paints a really interesting picture of the sort of the natural impulse of the elves and how it seems to be going against it. It's sort of a gentle. We don't get a sense of disharmony or things going awry here, but yet it does really seem things aren't panning out the way that the Valar had envisioned, right? Things don't actually end up being as perfectly blissful, as contentedly blissful as the sales pitch for Valinor actually made it sound. Yeah, Cheryl, I know it's super confusing about the elves and gnomes thing. Elves equals Vanyar. Well, elves equal Kendi equal Lindar equal Vanyar. The third group of elves, which are in the Silmarillion called the Vanyar, are here called the Kendi, which is just so. And then he changes it to Lindar, but sometimes they're just called the elves because that's not confusing or anything. James says he figured the lighthouse aspect was for the ships of the Teleri. Maybe it's a cooperative effort. Maybe it has to do with them. I don't know. I mean, I kind of think that the reference to the ships of mortals, few are the ships of mortals that have seen its marvelous beam, kind of points out like this tower might sound like a lighthouse, but it's not. Right? Or at least it's not a lighthouse that mortals have seen or can use. Anyway, okay. Let's. I'm moving on because I'm like totally out of time, but moving swiftly. Okay, more on the Kendi, light elves, Lindar, Vanyar folks. Most did Manwë and Varda love the Quendi, the light elves, and holy and immortal were all their deeds and songs. Don't ask me, I don't know what it means to have holy and immortal deeds and songs. I mean, I guess I know what holy deeds and songs are. I think I know what a holy deed or holy song would be like. I'm not 100% sure that I do, but I think I do. I'm not quite sure what it means to have an immortal deed or an immortal song. I mean, if ever we use a phrase like that, we generally mean immortal in the memory of others, but that doesn't seem like, and everything they did, everybody remembered all the time, does not seem to be a good summary of what's going on there. What it does seem to me to suggest is like they become set apart. Holiness always suggests that kind of untouchability, right? Separated from other things, set apart. The light elves become the set apart people, right? Because of Manwë and Varda's love for them and their love for Manwë and Varda. In the note here, Christopher explains that Tolkien had added this bit. But the love of the outer earth and the stars remained in the hearts of the Noldoli, and they abode there ever, that is in Tún upon Kor, and in the hills and valleys about the city. But the Lindar, that is the Quendi, which is the elves, which is the Vanyar, but the Lindar after a while grew to love rather the wide plains and the full light of Valinor. And they forsook Tún and came seldom back. Okay, so there is 1/3 of the elves who do become at home in Valinor, right? So they all like move to their like little halfway house there, right, on Tún, right, on the boundary, so they could see outwards towards Middle-earth and they could go back into Valinor if they wanted to. They moved back into Valinor full time. They forsook Tún and came seldom back, and the Noldoli became a separate folk, and their king was Finwë. Yet none dwelt in the tower of Ingwë, nor save such as tended that unfailing, nor something, there's a word missing, presumably this manuscript, save such as tended that unfailing lamp, and Ingwë was held ever as high king of all the Eldalië. So, their moving out of Tún is not a sundering, right? That is to say, it's not like a falling out between, let's call them the Lindar and the gnomes. It's not a demotion, right? It's not a like, and then they fell away, right? This is a promotion. It sounds like, right, that the Lindar are ascending to a new level, literally, as they're like moving to Taniquetil. I almost did the Martin Shaw thing again. They're moving to Taniquetil, the holy mountain, to live and hang out with Manwë and Varda full time. So that's nice. So the highest of the elves, the light elves, also called the high elves, also called the elves, are set apart, right? Immortal, holy, living up on the holy mountain with Manwë and Varda. So just that's an interesting point, an interesting moment, right? An interesting data point in understanding sort of the purpose and destiny of elves. And as I said, the question of how much did the Valar screw things up. How about the gnomes? The Noldoli, the deep elves, that men call gnomes, were beloved of Aule, and of Mandos the wise, and great was their craft, their magic and their skill, but ever greater their thirst for knowledge, and their desire to make things wonderful and new. In Valinor of their skill they first made gems, and they made them in countless myriads, and filled all tune with them, and all the halls of the gods were enriched. If you remember the Book of Lost Tales, you may recall that a great deal of time, well, okay, not a great deal of time, but anyway, a substantial paragraph was given to the details of this gem making. In the Book of Lost Tales, it was quite clear that gems were not mined and cut by the Noldor, or gnomes. They were made by them. They were crafted by them. They were a product. They invented them. And shaped them, and so again, it's not a mining and gem cutting thing. It's a craft. It's a craft item, and that seems to be the case here too. I think of their skill, they first made gems. That's still what I'm hearing here. They've not yet become miners. They are still making gems, like from scratch. Okay. So notice what we get here. First of all, notice these are the wise elves. How are they wise? Why are they wise? Well, remember the conversation we had last time about this, right? The Noldoli, still not quite yet the Noldor. The Noldoli, the gnomes, are wise in that sense that we talked about last time. They're wise in the sense of being cunning, being clever, being skilled in craft. In that sense, they are wise. Therefore, the wisdom of the gnomes makes them not less susceptible to temptation, but more susceptible to temptation. Just think about, kind of unpack for a second, their desire to make things wonderful and new, right? Ever greater their thirst for knowledge and their desire to make things wonderful and new. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing evil about desiring to make wonderful and new things. And yet, we can see already how easy it would be for those desires to be twisted, right? For them to get, say, wrapped up in the wonderfulness of the things that they make, right? To focus so much on making something new that they are driven to seek dangerous arts from an untrustworthy source, like, to choose a random example out of the air, somebody who comes along and says, "Hi, I'm a strange but friendly guy who can teach you how to make rings of power, which are awesome," right? If you have a thirst for knowledge and desire to make new things, that might sound really, really appealing to you, right? So yeah. Now, Adam, you're absolutely right to point out what would seem to be almost an inconsistency in that wise usage. That them being beloved of Aule makes perfect sense, right? As Aule is clearly very wise in the sense of crafty, cunning, clever. But Mandos, the wisdom of Mandos, we are accustomed to thinking not in that sense. Mandos doesn't make stuff with his hand. He's not a Saruman in that way. Again, as I was talking about the Anglo-Saxon word, So yeah, that's interesting. I'm wondering if that's kind of if he's kind of punning on that word deliberately there, or if, in some sense, this is true of Mandos as well. Not in the physical sense as it is with Aule. Is there some sense in which Mandos is a maker of things, not physical things, but spiritual things? I don't know. I don't even know, because Mandos, I've never fully gotten Mandos. Anyway, throwing out ideas here. But okay, so here's the wisdom of the elves. But of course, as we see this, we can see immediately how this can go wrong with Feanor. And Michael, by the way, you were right. Thinking about the Michael was saying that he figured that Mandos's doom, his reading of his pronouncing of dooms, was related to patterns, i.e., weaving and art. Yeah, you could say perhaps that he's cunning in the sense of his understanding of the music, right? And that's where he gets his, that is the music of the Ainur, and that's where he gets his dooms from. And of course, Michael, I can't help but remember, of course, his wife, which doesn't have yet, Vaire, the weaver, right? But the idea that eventually Mandos is going to be associated, even sort of at one remove like that, through his spouse, with woven webs, right? Woven tapestries, all through his halls. It does suggest that there's the wisdom, the knowledge of Mandos, the knowledge of his dooms, do seem to be derived from his ability to interpret patterns, the patterns of the music, as we see also, we see them sort of embodied in the patterns of Vaire's weaving later on. Not in the story yet, but anyway, okay. All right, back to the Silmarils. We now return to the Silmarils. In those far days, Feanor began on a time a long and marvellous labour, and all his power and all his subtle magic he called upon, for he purposed to make a thing more fair than any of the Eldar had yet had made, that should last beyond the end of all. All right, well, that's shooting large there. 3 jewels he made, and named them Silmarils. A living fire burned within them that was blended of the light of the 2 trees. Of their own radiance they shone even in the dark. No mortal flesh impure could touch them, but was withered and was scorched. These jewels the elves prized beyond all works of their hands, and Manwë hallowed them. And Varda said, "The fate of the elves is locked herein, and the fate of many things beside." The heart of Feanor was wound about the things that he himself had made. Yes, Arthur, it does seem that the burning of flesh... Wait, what's the word? It says flesh impure, right. The burning of mortal flesh impure by the Silmarils seems intrinsic to them. Manwë does hallow them here, but the burning of the flesh does not seem a consequence of that hallowing, but rather a consequence of their actual nature here. In a sense, if you just come from the published Silmarillion, like if you hadn't read the Book of Lost Tales or anything, this passage might not really sound like much. I mean, it would be cool because it's like, hey, look, it's the Silmarils, it's Feanor, there they are, right? Almost exactly the same as we see them in the published Silmarillion. But this is a big change. The Silmarils are pretty low profile in the Book of Lost Tales, really. They're a big deal. Feanor and his sons swear this oath, and the oath screws things up all over the place. But the Silmarils aren't really a big deal. And in fact, not only are they not sort of the center of what happens at the end in the final battles and everything, and sort of the fate of the Silmarils being a big deal, the fate of the Silmarils wasn't even, they kind of drop out of the story. In fact, there's even that famous little snippet of paper that Christopher Tolkien mentions where Tolkien wrote, like, what happened to the Silmarils? I wonder. Like, he hadn't even made up the story yet. So the idea, this idea that the fate of the elves is locked herein. This is a new element. It's a familiar element from our point of view, but it's a new element, and we can see even new from the sketch. The fate of the Silmarils and their involvement at the end of things in the sketch is the first time we see that stuff being integrated. Now, coming back to it from the beginning in the Quenta, we see that the mythic profile of the Silmarils has really risen, and they have really taken their central place in Tolkien's mythology. All right, I'm going to stop there because we're out of time, and I don't want to keep you guys too long. We did okay. It's not bad. We did okay. We're gaining now. We're going to continue with the Quenta next time. I've split the Quenta over 3 weeks because it's long, and I want to make sure to be able to get into it. And you don't have to read the whole thing aloud, but read it aloud. I want you to be able to hear what Tolkien is doing. We're not in non-literary plot summary anymore. We're now in literary plot summary for goodness sake. So please, I invite you to sort of savor the language there and see if there are any passages that really strike you that you think are really cool. Let me know. I would be really interested to hear what passages you found particularly lovely, particularly striking in that way. Anyway, okay. I'm going to let you guys go. Good night, everybody. I will see you guys next week for more Quenta. And I will say good night. Thanks, everybody. Bye.